St. Mildred's was the kind of English village one might find sketched upon a postcard. Gentle slopes of green, a scattering of cottages with rose-laden trellises, and the tall, dependable spire of the parish church, rising over the rooftops like a benevolent sentinel. It was late summer, that golden, drowsy time when the hedgerows were heavy with blackberries, and the air still held the warmth of July, though the evenings cooled into misty greys. Miss Jane Marple had been invited to St. Mildred's by her old friend, Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby, a kindly widow who had once shared with her the modest delights of Girton College teas in their youth. Dorothy had insisted Jane come to stay for promising a little peace, a good many cups of tea, and the most entertaining village gossip you'll hear outside of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, who knew well the charm of village gossip as both pastime and invaluable repository of human truth, had agreed at once that it was, she thought, as the branch line train trundled her into the station, precisely the sort of place where small things mattered very much indeed, and in Miss Marple's experience, it was in such quiet corners of the world that human passions sometimes burst forth most violently. At Village Whispers on her very first afternoon in St. Mildred, Miss Marple was treated to her hostess's gentle disclosures about the leading personalities of the parish. Over tea in the parlour, with lace curtains trembling in the summer breeze, Dorothy leaned forward conspiratorially. "You'll hear it soon enough, Jane, everyone does. St. Mildred's has its own mystery. Penfold Manor." Miss Marple, whose delicate hands folded neatly over her lap, looked politely interested. "Indeed, yes, poor Mrs. Penfold, lives there still, alone, except for a young companion. She's been a widow these 20 years, and a prickly creature, though not without her kindnesses. But the real talk, Jane, the real talk is about her attic." Her friend paused, letting the phrase hang like a secret. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Her attic?" Dorothy nodded. "Locked, always locked. Not a soul allowed up there. Not the maid, not the companion, not even the doctor. She keeps the key upon her at all times. People wonder, of course, what is she hiding? Old trunks, papers, skeletons, heaven knows what. There was even some silly story, years ago, that one might hear footsteps up there at night." Miss Marple permitted herself the faintest smile. "People are often more imaginative in the dark, my dear. Perhaps, but there's more. They say she argued dreadfully last week with her solicitor Mr. Whitmore about her will, and just yesterday, Clara Simmons, that's her companion, was heard saying, 'It isn't right, and it can't go on forever.'" Miss Marple's blue eyes, clear and mild as ever, rested upon her friend's face. "How interesting." She tucked away the morsel with the quiet satisfaction of one accustomed to pantry shelves lined with useful preserves. The lady of the height was at the village fete, held upon the vicarage lawns, that Miss Marple first encountered Mrs. Penfold. The fete was a lively affair. Stalls laden with homemade jams and knitted mittens, a white elephant table where one might purchase an unwanted ashtray or two, and children darting about with sticky toffee apples. Miss Marple, contentedly sipping weak lemonade, observed with her customary attention the small dramas of village life. A lady quarrelling with the raffle steward about her tickets, the vicar's wife attempting to keep her hat from the wind, a young maid casting wistful glances at the soldier home on leave. Mrs. Agnes Penfold arrived in a wheelchair pushed by Clara Simmons. She was a striking figure even in age, tall, once handsome, her features sharp with an aquiline nose and penetrating eyes that missed very little. She wore black silk, though the day was warm, a wide hat with a veil, and gloves upon her bony hands. Her presence parted the crowd. People greeted her politely, some with deference, others with barely concealed dislike. Miss Marple noticed the stiffness with which Clara bent to her employer, the faint weariness about her mouth. She also noticed Dr. Leonard Carraway, the village physician, approach with exaggerated cheerfulness. "My dear Mrs. Penfold, out and about? I see. Splendid. Splendid. Don't fuss me, Leonard," the old lady snapped. "I know my constitution better than you." Yet she permitted him to adjust the blanket across her knees. Miss Marple, watching, thought the doctor's solicitude had about it something of the stage. Rev. Charles Hargrove, the vicar, came soon after, pressing her hand warmly. "So pleased you could be here. Your support means a great deal to the parish." His words were correct, yet there was a guardedness in his expression, as though every syllable had been carefully weighed. Mr. Whitmore, the solicitor, arrived last, perspiring despite the shade. Mrs. Penfold fixed him with a glare that might have pierced plate armor. "Well, Henry, Have you recovered from our little altercation?" Whitmore muttered something about misunderstanding and all in due course. Miss Marple saw his fingers twitch at his hat brim nervously. Of death in public. It was just past 3 o'clock when the incident occurred. The brass band had struck up a jaunty march. Mrs. Penfold, resettled in her chair near the refreshment table, accepted a cup of tea poured out by Clara. The sun glinted upon the silver urn, upon the delicate china cup. Miss Marple, from her seat nearby, caught a faint whiff of almonds. As the steam rose, she blinked, for it was curiously out of place. Mrs. Penfold sipped. Then, with a sudden sharp gasp, she clutched her chest. The cup tumbled, shattering upon the grass. Her head lolled to one side. A little scream went up from the vicar's wife. Clara cried out, "Madame!" The doctor was instantly at her side, but even as he laid fingers upon her wrist, Miss Marple knew. "She is gone," Carroway declared solemnly after only a moment. "A seizure. Heart." Without doubt, the crowd buzzed with shock and pity, though some voices, Miss Marple noted them already, murmured otherwise. "Poison," whispered one matron behind her fan. "I smelt it. Tallman's. Cyanide," another breathed, as though savouring the delicious horror of it. Miss Marple did not join the speculation. She sat quietly, her knitting bag upon her lap, and watched Clara Simmons weep. Dr. Carroway insist upon natural causes, the vicar murmur a hasty prayer, and Mr. Whitmore look as though the ground beneath his feet had given way. Somewhere in the stir of voices, one sentence repeated itself like a refrain. "The attic. What will happen to the locked attic now?" The official verdict, delivered briskly by Dr. Leonard Carroway, was that Mrs. Penfold had died of natural causes. "The heart, my dear ladies, the heart. She was a frail woman, and excitement can be fatal." He spoke with all the firmness of medical authority, and for a few days the pronouncement held. Yet in St. Mildred's, where lives turned upon the smallest tremor of news, doubts multiplied like ivy across stone. Miss Marple, who believed firmly that people revealed themselves in their smallest, most habitual actions, resolved to watch more closely. She had, over the years, learnt that one need not seek information in villages. One only had to sit quietly and let it drift towards one, much as dust motes drift through a shaft of sunlight. A visit to Penfold Manor. It was Dorothy Weatherby who proposed calling upon Clara Simmons to offer condolences. Miss Marple, with her gentle manner, agreed readily. The manor stood at the edge of the village, an imposing Georgian house, with shuttered windows, and ivy climbing unchecked up its stone facade. It looked, Miss Marple thought, both proud and weary, like an old soldier standing stiff, despite rheumatism. Clara received them in a gloomy drawing-room. She was a slight young woman in her mid-20s, with anxious eyes and a look of exhaustion. Her morning dress was hastily altered, and did little to disguise her agitation. "Thank you for coming," she murmured. It is all such a shock. Mrs. Penfold was. She could be difficult, but she was my livelihood. I don't know what will become of me now." Miss Marple studied her kindly. "You must have cared for her a great deal to stay by her side." Clara hesitated, fingers twisting a handkerchief. "She wasn't easy, no, but there were times when she showed real kindness. She liked to think of herself as formidable. I suppose she was." Her eyes filled with tears. "I never thought she would go like that." Dorothy spoke soothingly, but Miss Marple asked with quiet directness, "Tell me, my dear, did she often complain of her heart?" Clara shook her head. "Never. She said her heart was as strong as iron. She would not even let Dr. Carroway fuss with her." "Oh, but he came so often these last weeks, more than usual." She said he was meddling. Miss Marple let the words settle. Clara had not meant them to be accusatory, but truth often escaped in such slips. Miss Marple let the words settle. Clara had not meant them to be accusatory, but truth often escaped in such slips. From upstairs came a faint creak, the groan of timbers. Clara stiffened visibly. "The attic," she whispered. "No one is allowed up there." She kept the key always in her reticule. "I don't know who has it now." Miss Marple, who never dismissed what others deemed silly fancies, filed this away carefully. Tea with the doctor 2 days later. Miss Marple encountered Dr. Carroway on the High Street. He was a brisk man in his 50s, ruddy-cheeked, with the bluff manner of one accustomed to being obeyed. "My dear Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said heartily. "I hear you were present at that most unfortunate business at the fete. Nasty shock, for all of us." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Such a public way to go. I thought it unusual." The doctor laughed. though a trifle too loudly. Unusual perhaps, but hardly suspicious. Her heart was weak, I assure you. I had warned her more than once, but Mrs. Penfold never listened to advice. Miss Marple smiled. So I gathered, though she did allow you to visit her frequently of late. His eyes flickered. Ah yes, purely precautionary, of course. At her age, one cannot be too careful. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. She told her companion she thought you meddled. The color rose in his cheeks. Clara Simmons is an ungrateful chit. I gave up hours to keep that old lady comfortable. It is no wonder she's distraught. Her position depends entirely on the will. He stopped abruptly, as though realizing he had said too much, and excused himself hurriedly. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression thoughtful. The vicar's is on Sunday. Rev. Charles Hargrove invited Miss Marple to tea. The vicarage garden was a peaceful spot, roses in bloom and bees humming industriously. Yet the vicar himself seemed distracted, his fingers drumming nervously upon the arm of his chair. It was a blow, Miss Marple, a real blow, he said gravely. Agnes Penfold had her faults, yes, but she was loyal to the parish. Her passing leaves a gap. Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately. I hear she was not without mysteries. The vicar shifted uncomfortably. Villagers talk too much. Agnes valued her privacy. That is all. But an attic locked for 30 years. Miss Marple murmured. Privacy of a very determined sort. Hargrove's face tightened. Some family matters are best left undisturbed. I knew her late husband, you see, and well, there were scandals in those days. Nothing we should rake up now. His voice carried a note of finality, but Miss Marple recognized avoidance when she heard it. She let the subject drop, outwardly at least, though her mind lingered upon the word scandal. The solicitor's distressed Mr. Henry Whitmore was another matter altogether. Miss Marple called upon him under the pretext of asking about charitable donations Mrs. Penfold had once made. His office was cluttered, papers in untidy heaps, and the man himself perspired nervously, as though perpetually pursued by creditors. Yes, Mrs. Penfold, he stammered, a client of long standing. Sad loss, very sad. She was particular, you understand, always very particular. Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic. Particular enough to quarrel with you about her will, I hear. His hands shook. Gossip, mere gossip. Wills are complicated matters. Naturally disagreements arise. He dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief. The truth is, she had threatened to alter everything, to cut out some beneficiaries entirely. I tried to reason with her. It was most unpleasant. And did she succeed? Miss Marple asked mildly. I cannot say until the will is read. Confidential, you know. He looked as though the word confidential were a fragile shield against disaster. Miss Marple left him with the distinct impression of a man terrified, though whether of financial ruin, exposure, or something darker, she could not yet tell. Threads of suspicion that night. As Miss Marple sat knitting by the Weatherby hearth, she reflected upon what she had learned. Clara Simmons was dependent upon Mrs. Penfold's will, but her grief had seemed genuine. Dr. Carroway had insisted too much upon natural causes, and his visits had been suspiciously frequent. Rev. Hargrove hinted at some scandal from the past, buried in that locked attic. Mr. Whitmore was clearly in a panic about the will, and then there was the simple but damning fact. The smell of almonds in Mrs. Penfold's last cup of tea. Miss Marple, who had seen human nature in its most devious disguises, felt certain Mrs. Penfold had not died by chance. Somewhere among the tangled threads of wills, scandals, and secrets, a hand had tightened the knot. For several days after Mrs. Penfold's sudden death, St. Mildred's was alive with speculation. The baker swore she had overheard Clara Simmons refuse to sleep at the manor. The postmistress whispered that Mr. Whitmore had been seen burning papers late at night, and more than one villager repeated always with relish that the vicar had once paid an unusually large sum to hush up a scandal in his congregation. Miss Marple listened, as was her habit, but she did not confuse quantity of gossip with quality of truth. Instead, she sought the quiet silences between words, the things people didn't say. The reading of the will. The turning point came with the reading of Mrs. Penfold's will, held in the gloomy dining room of the manor. The room smelled faintly of dust and furniture polish. Heavy curtains kept out the bright afternoon sun. Present were Clara, pale but composed, Dr. Carroway, bluff and officious, Rev. Hargrove, grave and tight-lipped, and Mr. Whitmore, perspiring freely over his papers. Miss Marple, by special invitation of her friend Dorothy, sat unobtrusively in a corner. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles, coughed, and began. To my companion, Clara Simmons, I leave an annual allowance of £50. Clara's lips parted in shock. It was a pittance barely enough to survive on. To my solicitor, Henry Whitmore, I leave a small bequest in gratitude for his years of service. The man looked as though gratitude were the last thing he expected. The remainder of my estate, including Penfold Manor, I bequeath to the parish of St. Milton, under the trusteeship of the Reverend Charles Hargrove, to be used for charitable purposes. There was a stunned silence. Charitable purposes, Clara whispered. Hargrove's face tightened. A most generous gift, if somewhat unexpected. Whitmore cleared his throat nervously. It is, of course, entirely proper. The document was executed only last month. Miss Marple, though outwardly placid, noted the tremor in his voice. Dr. Carroway snorted. Madness, I call it. The old woman never trusted the church with a farthing while she lived, and now, suddenly, the manor goes to it. Preposterous. Clara rose, trembling. She promised me, I heard her say it, that I would be looked after. This cannot be right. But Whitmore only spread his hands helplessly. Miss Marple watched the small drama with interest. If Mrs. Penfold had indeed changed her will so recently, what had compelled her to do so? And why had she left her faithful companion almost nothing? The attic key. Later that afternoon, Clara discovered the key to the attic, tucked into the lining of Mrs. Penfold's red. The discovery spread through the village like wildfire. Soon the vicar and solicitor insisted upon opening the attic, for the good of the estate. Miss Marple accompanied them, her mild expression betraying nothing of her anticipation. The attic stairs creaked underfoot, dust motes rising with every step. At the top, Whitmore fitted the key into the lock with fumbling fingers. The door swung open to reveal a large, dim space filled with trunks, boxes, and cobwebs. The air was close, tinged with mothballs, and something older secrets preserved too long. Clara gasped. I never thought I'd see inside. They lifted the lids of trunks, yellowed letters, photographs, a child's toys long forgotten. One trunk contained ledgers, papers bound with ribbon, and most damning of all, a packet of correspondence revealing that Agnes Penfold's late husband had fathered an illegitimate child before their marriage. Rev. Hargrove looked stricken. Good heavens, I had prayed this would never come to light. Whitmore mopped his brow. This could ruin reputations. No wonder she kept it locked away. Miss Marple fingered one of the faded photographs. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, stood stiffly in sailor suit. The likeness to the Penfold family was unmistakable. Secrets, she murmured, have a way of growing heavier the longer they are kept. Suspicions shift. The revelation ignited a new blaze of speculation. Perhaps the vicar knew all along, villagers whispered. If he concealed such a scandal, who knows what else? Or Whitmore, another said darkly. What if those papers proved financial misdeeds? He looked ready to faint up there. Even Clara fell under suspicion. She must have known about the child. People said, maybe she tried to use it against her mistress. Dr. Carroway scoffed at them all. Ridiculous. A family indiscretion hardly explains a seizure at a fete. But his insistence only drew attention to himself. Miss Marple watched quietly. She had learned long ago that when a secret is exposed, guilty and innocent alike betray themselves in their reactions. The fire in the night. 2 nights later, a strange glow was seen from the manor. Clara, who had been sleeping in a downstairs room, rushed into the street crying for help. Villagers hurried to find smoke billowing from the attic window. Buckets were fetched, water thrown, and after frantic effort, the flames were subdued. Fortunately, the fire had not spread beyond a pile of papers, those same letters and ledgers found in the trunks. It was deliberate, Clara cried. Someone tried to destroy them. Whitmore stammered. Perhaps spontaneous combustion. Old papers sometimes. No, said Miss Marple softly, examining the charred remains. This was no accident. Someone feared what might be discovered. Her eyes, calm but penetrating, rested briefly upon Dr. Carroway, who avoided her gaze. Red herrings multiplied. Following days brought more puzzles than answers. A bottle of sleeping draught was found, missing from Mrs. Penfold's medicine cabinet. Clara insisted she had not taken it. Dr. Carroway claimed it was of no consequence, but his dismissal rang hollow. Rumors spread that Mrs. Penfold had been preparing yet another change to her will, one that would have favored Clara, had Whitmore suppressed it. An elderly gardener recalled hearing raised voices between Mrs. Penfold and the vicar a week before her death. Something about shame and forgiveness, he said. Each clue seemed damning, yet none conclusive. Miss Marple, however, was less concerned with the scandalous child or the wills than with the very ordinary matter of tea. Who had poured it? Who had handed it to Mrs. Penfold? And why had the doctor been so quick to declare heart failure? She knitted quietly by Dorothy's hearth, letting the threads of gossip and evidence weave themselves together. She had seen it many times before. When too many red herrings swam about, the fisherman must look to the current beneath. Miss Marple had always believed that truth rarely arrived with a grand flourish. More often it appeared quietly, like a shy child at the edge of a room, waiting for someone to notice. Over the next days, she allowed events at St. Mildred's to unfold, listening carefully and knitting steadily, while her sharp mind unraveled the knots of deception. The quiet visit to the doctor, it was Dorothy who arranged it. "Jane," she whispered over tea, "if you are determined to poke about in this dreadful business, you might start with Dr. Carroway. He has been most unsettled of late." So Miss Marple walked the short lane to the doctor's house, her step steady, despite her years. The man received her with forced cheer, offering a seat in his book-lined study. "I must say, Miss Marple, all this gossip is most unfortunate." The old lady had a weak heart, nothing more to it. Miss Marple smiled gently. "How fortunate that you were on hand to recognize it at once. Such experience must be comforting to the village." The compliment, though mild, made him fidget. "Well, yes, of course. I've seen dozens of such cases. Textbook." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes lowered. "And yet," she said softly, "one cannot help but notice that Mrs. Penfold was drinking tea prepared by another hand that day. It is curious, is it not, that a woman robust enough to scold her companion one moment should be dead the next?" Carroway's spoon clattered into his saucer. "Are you suggesting poison?" "Oh dear me, no," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I merely observe that the missing sleeping draught might account for certain symptoms. It has a bitter taste, does it not?" The doctor's color rose. "It was misplaced, nothing more. People will say anything." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her gaze kind yet unyielding. "But what people say is often less important than what they do. You seemed most eager to dismiss the idea of foul play, almost as though you feared an inquiry might complicate matters for you." His eyes flickered, but he said nothing further. Miss Marple tucked away the reaction as one more stitch in her mental tapestry. Clara's confession later that evening. Clara Simmons arrived at Dorothy's cottage, her face drawn and eyes swollen from tears. "I must speak to you, Miss Marple," she said, wringing her hands. "I cannot bear it any longer." Miss Marple guided her gently into a chair. "My dear, you have been most loyal to your mistress. Whatever burden you carry, it may not be as damning as you fear." Clara shook her head. "You do not understand. I loved her, in my way, but she could be cruel. She often reminded me that I was nothing without her charity. And I thought the new will might change things. She promised me, but then she gave everything to the church. I went to her room that night, after the fete. I wanted to plead with her to change it back." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "And did you?" Clara's voice cracked. "She laughed at me, told me I was grasping, ungrateful. I left in a rage, but I swear I did not harm her. When I heard she was dead, I thought perhaps my anger brought it about, that God punished me." Tears flowed freely now, but Miss Marple only patted her hand. "My dear, God does not use sleeping draughts. You may have quarreled, but you are not a murderess." Clara sobbed with relief, but Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful. Quarrels provided motive, yes, but not method. Clara lacked the cold precision required for such an act. The vicar's trouble the next day brought another revelation. Miss Marple attended morning prayers at St. Mildred's, where the Reverend Hargrove preached earnestly on the wages of sin and the mercy of forgiveness. His voice trembled at moments, and Miss Marple noted how he avoided meeting the eyes of his congregation. Afterwards, she lingered in the churchyard, admiring the roses until the vicar emerged. "Reverend," she said gently, "a most moving sermon. Yet you seem troubled in spirit." He sighed heavily. "I cannot deny it, I begged Mrs. Penfold not to reveal certain indiscretions from long ago. The illegitimate child, you understand. She promised me she would keep it secret. And yet, when I heard she had changed her will in the parish's favor, I feared she intended to use the gift as a form of confession." "You feared disgrace," Miss Marple said. His face reddened. "For the parish, not myself. Scandal harms the innocent as much as the guilty." but I swear to you, I had no hand in her death. I would rather face shame than take a life." Miss Marple inclined her head. His distress seemed genuine, yet she filed away his words. The will had not been an act of generosity, but of guilt. Agnes Penfold had sought absolution in brick and mortar, leaving her secrets buried in the attic. The solicitor slipped the final piece fell into place at Mr. Whitmore's office. Miss Marple called on him under the pretense of seeking advice about her own modest affairs. The solicitor was harried, his desk strewn with papers. "These villagers will drive me mad," Miss Marple demanding explanations, questioning the will, as though I had forged it myself. Miss Marple smiled mildly. "But surely, Mr. Whitmore, you are accustomed to managing difficult estates. Why, you even drew up a codicil for Mrs. Penfold only a fortnight before her death, did you not?" His pen froze mid. "Who told you that?" Miss Marple blinked innocently. "Why, you did, just now." Colour drained from his face. Slip of the tongue. There was no such codicil, but Miss Marple, with her lifetime of observing human frailty, knew better. A codicil had existed on its disappearance, explained much. Clara's expected inheritance had been erased, leaving her destitute and who had profited? Not Clara, not the vicar, whose conscience was tormented, not even the long-dead child, no. The person who profited was the one who stood to lose everything if scandal arose, the doctor, whose professional reputation could not withstand a whisper of malpractice. The quiet deduction that evening. Miss Marple sat by the fire at Dorothy's cottage, her knitting laid aside. She thought of the fate, of the teacup lifted to thin lips, of the doctor's hasty pronouncement. She thought of the missing draft, the attic fire, the will. Each clue was a thread. Alone they meant little, but together they formed a tapestry of guilt. Mrs. Penfold had threatened to expose Dr. Carraway's long-ago error that had cost a patient her life. Miss Marple had overheard the gossip once, whispered years ago, a misprescribed dose, hushed up with influence and money. If such a scandal resurfaced now, his practice would be ruined, so he had acted. A small measure of sleeping draught in her tea at the fete, masked by sugar. The symptoms were indistinguishable from heart failure. His authority ensured no questions were asked, but he had not foreseen the attic being opened, or the will causing such stir. In panic, he had tried to burn the papers, fearing they might hold evidence against him. That rash act betrayed him more surely than the poison ever could. Preparing the stage, Miss Marple knew better than to accuse a man outright. Truth must be revealed in such a way that it convinces even the most skeptical, and so she arranged a small gathering at the manor, ostensibly to discuss the estate. As the vicar, solicitor, doctor, and Clara assembled in the dim parlour, Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual chair, her hands folded serenely. "My friends," she began, "we have all been distressed by Mrs. Penfold's sudden passing. There has been much talked, perhaps. I believe it is time we sought clarity." The others shifted uneasily. Dr. Carraway tugged at his collar. "Mrs. Penfold," Miss Marple continued, "was not taken by natural causes. She was given a substance sleeping draught. To be precise, it was administered in her tea at the fete. Only one among us had both the means and the knowledge to do so." A silence followed, heavy as the air before a storm. Carraway blustered. "This is absurd, a vicious rumor." But Miss Marple's calm voice cut through. "On the contrary, it is the only explanation that fits, and tomorrow, when the inspector examines the teacupius, I ask that it be preserved, he will find the residue." Gasps met her words. Whitmore stared. The vicar paled. Clara clasped her hands in terror. Miss Marple turned her eyes upon the doctor. "You see, Dr. Carraway, the truth always does come out. And now, I fear, it is your turn to confess." The parlour at Penfold Manor had never seemed so oppressive. Heavy drapes muffled the evening light, and the large grandfather clock ticked with inexorable solemnity. Miss Marple sat in her usual quiet manner, hands folded on her lap. As the assembled company, Clara Simmons, Mr. Whitmore, Reverend Hargrove, and Dr. Carraway, waited with thinly veiled tension. Dorothy bustled discreetly about, ensuring everyone had tea. Only Miss Marple's calm presence suggested that this was not some dreadful inquest, but merely another of the village's little gatherings. Yet all knew that something momentous was about to occur. The final confrontation. Miss Marple began in her deceptively gentle voice. "I have often noticed," she said, "that in villages such as ours, people think secrets can be locked away. But secrets are stubborn things, and like water they find their way through the smallest cracks. Her eyes rested briefly on each face. Mrs. Penfold had such a secret, hidden in her attic. We all know of it now. The child her husband fathered before marriage. But that was not the secret that killed her. Dr. Carroway shifted in his chair, color high. Miss Marple went on. On the day of the fete, Mrs. Penfold was in fine health for a lady of her years. She scolded Clara. She laughed at some trifles. She tasted jam and praised the sponge cake. Then, quite suddenly, she collapsed. A seizure, the doctor said. And who would question it, when the village doctor himself declared it so? Whitmore muttered, a most natural assumption. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Natural, unless one recalls the missing bottle of sleeping draught. A draught which, in sufficient quantity, would induce just such a collapse. I had reason to suspect it had been added to her tea, and only one among us had both knowledge of its properties, an opportunity to ensure she drank it. Her gaze fixed steadily on Dr. Carroway. The doctor's hand trembled against the arm of his chair. This is outrageous, he cried. You cannot prove. I need not prove. Miss Marple interrupted gently. I merely observe. You pronounced death by heart failure within moments, without so much as a proper examination. You insisted no inquiry was necessary, and when the attic was opened, and old papers discovered, you tried to destroy them in a fire, not because they revealed Mrs. Penfold's scandal, but because you feared they contained something else. The others leaned forward, spellbound. You see, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but implacable. Years ago there was talk of a young woman who died after being given the wrong medicine. The matter was hushed up, but Mrs. Penfold knew of it. She threatened to expose you, did she not? And when she altered her will yet again, perhaps hinting at such a revelation, you realized your career would be finished. So you silenced her, with the very draught you had once misprescribed. A dreadful hush fell over the room. Clara gasped. The vicar murmured a prayer. Whitmore mopped his brow. Carroway's face crumpled. She left me no choice, he whispered. I have given my life to this village, to be ruined over one mistake that cost 2 lives, Miss Marple said firmly. For it was not error that ended Mrs. Penfold's days, but murder. And murder, Dr. Carroway, is never excusable. The doctor's fall for a long moment. Only the ticking clock could be heard. Then the doctor slumped in his chair, defeated. I did not mean for her to suffer, he said hoarsely. Just a quiet passing. She would have destroyed me otherwise. Miss Marple inclined her head. And so, to save your name, you destroyed hers, and in doing so, your own as well. That is the way of sin, I'm afraid. It begins with concealment and ends with ruin. When the inspector arrived later that night, summoned by Dorothy's discreet telephone call, Carroway offered no resistance. He was led away, shoulders bowed, a broken man. The aftermath, in the days that followed, the village hummed with its usual mixture of relief and relish. The doctor's arrest was the talk of every hearth and head. The women at the shop shook their heads over his downfall. The men at the pub debated how such a clever fellow could have been so foolish. Clara, freed from suspicion, seemed both relieved and adrift. She had lost her benefactress and gained little security, but Miss Marple ensured Dorothy took her in, at least for a time. It will do her good, Miss Marple observed, to be among kindness rather than condescension. The vicar, humbled, resolved to use the manor's legacy for the benefit of orphans, perhaps as a form of atonement for his silence over the Penfold scandal. Mr. Whitmore, though flustered, regained some dignity by arranging matters with unusual efficiency. As for the attic, it was at last cleared properly. The trunks were catalogued, the letters stored safely, and the dusty space transformed into a modest reading room for the parish children. Thus, from secrets and sorrow, a small good blossomed. Miss Marple's reflection one afternoon, as the autumn sun slanted through the cottage window, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and reflected upon it all. Dorothy, bustling with a tray of seed cake, remarked, "You do astonish me, Jane, how you see through people. I should never have suspected Dr. Carroway." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, it is much like tending a garden. Weeds have a way of showing themselves. No matter how cleverly one tries to plant roses over them, one has only to know the signs." Dorothy laughed, though she shivered slightly. "Still, it is a dreadful thing to think of a man we trusted, a man who cared for our health. Human nature," Miss Marple said softly, "is the same in a country parish as in a great city. Pride, fear, vanity, these are universal. The trappings differ, but the heart is much alike everywhere. That is why it is so easy to recognize." She took up her needles again. the rhythm of knitting a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. "Poor Mrs. Penfold," she murmured. "For all her faults, she deserved better than such an end. Yet perhaps, in her death, some measure of truth has been restored." And with that, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, content to let the quiet rhythms of St. Mary Medore, in this case, St. Mildred's, resume their course. Closing scene. Weeks later, at the village green, life seemed almost back to normal. Children played, women exchanged gossip, men mended fences. The Fete Committee even began to speak of next year's event, albeit with less enthusiasm for tea, served by strangers. Miss Marple, passing by with her basket, paused to watch them. She allowed herself a small smile. Villagers had their dramas, their tragedies, but they also had resilience. In the end, life carried on quiet, ordinary, yet threaded with the unspoken knowledge that beneath every surface lay hidden depths. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever gentle, was content to be the one who noticed.